Hope for the Soul. Hey, guys.
What up? Hey, everybody. Thanks for listening or tuning in to Hope for the Soul today. For listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or Google or Stitcher or any of the places that we send our podcast to. Thank you for tuning in. If you're watching on Facebook, as always, like, share. If you're watching on YouTube or ConroeChurch.live, thank you for tuning in. We're honored that you would be with us today. I'm super happy. I've got one of my good friends who I've met a year ago, Ryan Dean. He pastors in Bossier, Louisiana. And so I'm glad to have him on the podcast. Ryan, welcome, buddy.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So we met a year ago. It was here at youth camp. So, and I think that whenever I met you, it was kind of like we click. And we've stayed in touch a good bit. So why don't you kind of introduce yourself and tell our listeners who you are and what your passions are in life, and then we'll just have a conversation. So.
Oh, boy. Pastor at the Pentecostals of Bossier City.
Yeah.
And that's been almost a year now, which is kind of hard to believe, but spent 3 years prior to that as the assistant pastor, and then the 15 years prior to that as the youth pastor. Started at 20. Married my wife at 23. Sherry and I have been married 16 years. Got 3 children, Raylan, River, and Georgia, 10, 7, and 2. So we've got our hands full with that. But, yeah, as far as interest, besides obviously the reason I'm here is church stuff, that's the obvious thing is all that. But, big Arsenal fan. People don't care about that in America, so I say that, and they instantly fall asleep. Formula One, just a bunch of nerd stuff, basically. A lot of it I'm not going to admit on this podcast.
So you are from North Louisiana, or is that Central Louisiana?
Yes, northwestern Louisiana. So northwestern Louisiana, the rest of Louisiana doesn't consider you part of Louisiana.
That's great.
They consider us part of Texas and Arkansas, but they don't consider us part of them. So we're,
So you are a fan of pretty much European-style sports.
Yes.
In the land of country folks.
Yes. People in our church say that I'm a communist because of all that. That's,
That makes sense. That's kind of the same here. Our demographic is the same. We're southeast Texas, but we're not Cajun. We're rednecks. So not really rednecks.
I think they're Cajun. But it's strange that there was not one New Orleans Saint fan in northwestern Louisiana until Drew Brees.
Yeah.
Before that, they didn't exist. Everybody was a Cowboys fan. Exactly.
Yeah.
And suddenly they're all gone.
Yeah.
So, I don't buy it.
Yeah.
That's what it is.
So it's crazy how similar our stories are. So you've been married how long?
16.
16 years. We've been married 14 years. You've been in full-time ministry for how long?
Oh, my goodness. 19 years.
So we've been 15 years or 14 and a half years. And then obviously 3 kids each. And it's crazy how, like, we have so many mutual friends and we haven't met until a year ago.
I know. It's weird.
And,
my wife said that she's known your whole life.
So my parents, they didn't start our church, but it was like a preaching point or a really small word. 8 people elected us. And so we give credit for the Dykes family who started our church. But from 8 people to where we are now, we didn't start it, but we came in at the ground floor. And I remember in our storefront days, we had I think 6 or 7 orange pews. It was like a 60 by 25 or 20 or 30 foot storefront. And I was like 3 or 4 years old. And that's the first time the Braniffs came and preached.
Oh my goodness.
Because Sherry and her sister, Tanya, right?
That's her mom is Tanya.
Tanya.
Shanna is her
Shanna,
sister.
I knew that. Oh my goodness.
Was her brother Shane with him at the time?
Shane,
Okay.
And they would sing, "There's a promise coming down your dusty road." Yes. So
I'm just living in my temporary home.
Yes.
Yeah.
Of course, the Hagans. Oh my
yeah.
goodness. Great friends. So Lisa and Anthony Hagan. Lisa is my mom's first or second cousin somehow. So that's how we're all related to that side.
Yeah, Sherry
of the
mentioned
family.
that y'all related, but she's related to everybody except me.
Yes, thank God.
Hopefully.
Just don't go research that. Oh man, and then obviously pastoring. You said you pastored for a year.
Yeah.
We pastored for a year.
It's crazy.
I think a part of the reason why our friendship took off like it did last year is because we had just been elected pastor, and you were about to be elected pastor, and we kind of had some of those conversations.
Yeah, you and your dad helped me tremendously with that sit down. We talked for probably 2 hours about it.
Yeah.
And it alleviated a lot of the fears that I had, a lot of the worries. Not all of them, but a ton. And,
all the worries except for waiting on the vote.
Yeah.
That's so, man. That was so nerve wracking. But so obviously you come from a very missions giving church, and your family is known, like your family's reputation is impeccable. And we talked a little bit, I think today, or it was yesterday, about how we have to guard our family's reputation, not because we're not our own men, but we recognize that we've been given a legacy. So maybe talk a little bit about what that means to you, your family, your dad, your mom.
Yeah, both of my grandfathers were the only ones in their family at the time that bought into this. On both sides at almost the same time. My mom's father was about 10 years younger. But yeah, my grandfather on my dad's side came home from World War II. He'd been shot 3 different times in 3 separate countries.
Wow.
Comes back home. On the battlefield, one of the times he was shot, he was face down in the snow. A tank was mowing everybody down, one after another. He buried his face in the snow as he watched the guy beside him pass away.
Oh, my goodness.
He said, God, if you just save me, I'll do anything. I'll do whatever you need me to do, anything. And tank rolls by him. Everybody else around him was slaughtered. He goes back home, and he started living up to it. Well, somebody said, hey, why don't you go visit that church down the road? And his family said, don't go down there because they're throwing something on the people, and it's causing them to act strange. Yeah. So they're throwing something on the altars. He's like, well, that sounds interesting. Yeah. Goes there. I'm going to make a long story very short. They both get baptized and receive the Holy Ghost at about the same time. But, yeah, both sides of the family, I'm very protective of them because not like anybody's attacking them. Yeah. Like you said, the reputation is what it is. But, yeah, very protective of the heritage that we have. And so anytime anybody has any questions, it always comes from a place in my mind, like I'm guarding this with my life because, yeah it's what's your family like beyond your parents?
So both sides of my family are ministry families.
Yeah.
My mom's dad, he passed away when my mom was 18, but he pastored in Birmingham, Alabama, and then Mobile, Alabama. And so, and then my dad's family is preachers as well. And so almost all my mom's siblings are involved in ministry, some form or fashion. She has a sister who, her and her husband pastor just a few minutes down the road from us in Houston. Other sisters that are involved in ministry in their churches. Then my dad is the oldest of all of his siblings, and they are all in ministry, either missionaries or just pastoring, evangelists, lay leaders in the church. So, like, this is all we know. Like, it's what we're doing right now, talking church, talking family. Yeah. That's all we know. So it's not something that I do because it's my family, and I think this is you too, obviously. Of course, it's all we know and it's all we're comfortable with, but we also, God has a call on my life, you know. And
so you said earlier today we were talking, and you said that we kind of had a similar story also, and that we didn't want it for a while, like fought it pretty hard. Like, there was about a 4-year period I told people I was an atheist, and then sometimes I'd say an agnostic, and then sometimes I'd go to camp and I'd forget both of those things for about 5 days, and then I'd go back home and I'd start not believing again.
You gotta jump and shout because girls are watching.
Oh,
like right now we're at camp.
If only I was pursuing those girls, that would have been a perfect plan.
That's right.
But yeah, and then my wife was up there singing in the choir. So, you know. But I forgot how we got there.
Me too.
Yeah, but no, we had a similar story in that we didn't want it for a while, and I used to tell people, "There's no way I'm not going to be a preacher. I've seen what that does to people. I'm not doing it." And then it's almost like God had to bash me in the face a little bit in order to make me want to do it. Yeah. But now that I'm here, I'm like, I kind of knew all along.
Yeah, feels right.
Yeah.
It's something like whenever you settle into your purpose in life, like everything else just kind of fades away, and there's still obviously important priorities. We're husbands, we're fathers, we've got friends, we've got people that we have to, and responsibilities that we have to take care of. But there's something, I think it's fortunate that as young as we were able to find our purpose, and we didn't have to bounce from vocation to vocation or career to career. Like, we just, maybe it's going back to our parents, they just helped us settle in and get situated. But it hasn't always been easy for us, especially for you, your story. A lot of people have heard your story, but probably just as many people haven't heard your story. Being raised in a minister's home, glass house, comes with a lot of pressure. And I think that my story is, I come from an incredible church, and I never really felt, there was never really a lot of scandal. I was never really crazy, bad, or rebellious, never really lost or hurt my reputation. But that pressure does get real, and it gets lonely. And I think your story you talked about last year at camp about how as a young adult and teenager, you struggled with anxiety and depression and all that. So maybe could you talk about that a little bit, your testimony and how God's used that?
Yeah, and jump in whenever you.
Okay.
Don't let me just ramble forever because I first can kind of identify when it started happening when I was probably 11 years old, if I remember correctly. Because I remember at camp dealing with it, and whenever it hit, I would just want to shut down and disappear. Well, at camp, you're not really allowed to do that. And I remember the feelings that were brought. When I went to a campground, it's not just because of the heat in Tioga, Louisiana. Like I would sweat profusely literally the entire time because I was scared to death. I didn't know how to talk to people. I couldn't make eye contact with people. I hated public situations of any kind. If my parents said, hey, take this and go pay for our meal at the cash register, I would start shaking and trembling because I didn't want to have that interaction. Yeah. But I remember 11 years old, the first struggle with depression, really. And it came out of nowhere, and I didn't know what it was. And it got a little bit more aggressive maybe over the next few years until my sister, who's like an angel, when she lost her child who only lived for a few days, I was born at 23 weeks. When my sister lost that baby, I held it after it passed away.
My goodness.
And that's like I can point to that time is when I basically told God, like, I'm not believing you anymore. Like I'm going to doubt everything from this point forward. And so I kind of broke like in pieces. I felt it as I held the baby. I looked down and my tears were just falling off of my face and I was crying. I was angry. And then I spent the next few years like bitterly angry. And it got more and more, and I dealt with it in complete secrecy. I didn't tell anybody. So, 14, 15, 16 years old, completely alone. But I always wrote about it. I wrote about it in these little notebooks, and then I'd hide these notebooks and keep them hidden away. And it progressed to the point where finally I went home and I started cutting a little bit. And I wasn't doing it. At that time, nobody talked about cutting. I never heard it. Like, I didn't hear about it until actually years later. And I would do it because I didn't consider it like a rush of endorphins. That's not why I was doing it, because it made me feel better. I did it because I considered it almost like getting used to the idea of pain. Because my goal is I wanted to die. I didn't want to live. I hated being in public. I hated being in private. I hated being by myself. I hated being with crowds. And it got to the point where that's all I thought about. I listened to music that dealt with it. I read books that dealt with it. I never read anything that tried to dissuade me. I just wanted to kind of live in it. And it became like an identity thing. This is who I am. I'm the person that's going to die young. And everybody's going to wonder why. And I almost romanticized that a little bit. And it's suicidal ideation is kind of I've read about it, but nothing ever makes perfect sense to me with it. Because I can't explain why I wanted to die. I can't explain even that people say, is it low serotonin? Yeah, but I don't know what made me want to die. Mm-hmm. I know there was a spiritual attack that came.
That's what I was about to say. There's a spiritual aspect to it.
Yeah, I think that's where that's what pushed it over the edge, I think. And I was cutting. There's one song. I don't like to name the song because I don't like people to go and look it up.
You don't glorify it.
But there was one song that I would always put on repeat. I'd lock my door in my room and I'd stand in front of my CD player and I had to keep it low because parents lived in the house.
Mom would come in and break that CD.
Oh my goodness. Right. One time my mom in the middle of the night, she knew I was fighting all this stuff later. So we'll get to that. But she was praying outside of my doorway in the hallway, and she was speaking in tongues as loud as humanly possible at like 2 a.m. And I remember I was like, I just got up, I walked to the door, and I just shut the door as hard as I could and then went back to bed. But she just got louder and amped it up even more. But they knew there was a spiritual component to it. But I dealt with that in secret. I got to tell you how it became public. So I wrote about it in these notebooks all the time. And I go to this little Christian school, and we don't teach Spanish or French. We teach Latin because there's so many uses for a dead language. Okay. And so we're learning Latin, and I'm trying to learn the conjugations, and I was terrible at it because I didn't want to study. And so I'd never cheated in my life, not once, and not since. But that day I was like, I'm cheating. So I wrote down the conjugations. I cut it off into like a little 2x3 piece of paper. I put it in my uniform shirt pocket, and then I was leaning over.
Trying to open that pocket.
And as it would open up, I would glance down and I would see just enough. And then our teacher, he was our principal as well, he walked out of the classroom and I'm like, oh, perfect. And I'll slide it out and I'm going, and his wife walks by the room and she sees me and I went and put it back in my pocket really quickly. And I saw her run off. I'm like, oh my goodness, what am I going to do? He's going to find it. So I took it out of my pocket and then I started chewing on it. I was like, I'm going to swallow this cheat sheet. And I choked it down. I about gagged myself to death. And he finally comes in and he's like, he doesn't say a word. He just comes up to me, he starts looking through my stuff, and he looks in my pockets, and he makes me stand up and open up my pockets on my pants. And I'm like, there's nothing, But then he opens up my notebook, and he turns it, and he keeps on looking, and then he stops. And I'm like, oh, my goodness, I know what he just found. And when I was young and I was so emotional, I used to write a lot of poetry, and it is not good. But this one poem, it talked directly to my family and to my parents. Oh, my goodness. And, bro, I can't even, I don't like to even think back to everything that was said in it, but it focused really in on the church. Yeah. And it focused on what I wanted to do and what my plan was. And I spent so much time on it. But then he didn't say a word. He just walked out of the room. About 5 minutes later, he comes back in the room, puts my notebook down, and doesn't say a word. And I'm like, well, why did he do that? Well, he made a copy, and he put it in a letter, and he gave it to my parents. And then my dad just sits us down at the kitchen table, and he said, we've got to talk. And he said, I want you to tell me everything that's going on. And that's when it finally unloaded. And he said, Ryan, he said, if the church is your problem, I will quit today. He's like, I promise you, I'll quit now if that will help. Will it help? And I started crying because I knew that he meant it. My dad doesn't say anything out of jest. I knew he meant it, and I started bawling. And it was a long process, but wound up with a counselor. The first counselor, I didn't open up at all to. As a matter of fact, I just straight up lied a lot just because I wanted to see what her reaction would be. But she did wind up helping me towards the end because I finally felt guilty about it. And but yeah, I've had 4 different counselors in life. But ask a question, so I'll stop talking.
No. I think this is awesome because this is stuff that I've heard in sermon format, but never in conversational format. And I think what's so powerful is that your dad loved you enough to lay everything else aside. And I also want to go back and that point of there was a point of exposure when your teacher or principal found that, and I'm sure your heart sank or your emotions probably went crazy. Cold
saved
sweats.
My life.
Yeah, and exactly. Sometimes the most uncomfortable situations we get ourselves in is the point that God uses to reach us. And I think that there's probably been more uncomfortable situations in your life, maybe not that drastic. I know there's been in my life, and it's led us to where we are now. And now the faithfulness of God. You might not know this about me, but I think God takes men through things not to do bad to them, but to grow their character and to teach them to trust and teach them to have faith. And I don't have any crazy horror stories like that. That's a terrible way to say it. I don't have.
No, it makes sense.
I don't have your story. My story is much different. But I do have things that in my life that have happened that have helped build me and make me who I am today. I was ran over by a car at 5 years old, seizures, all that kinds of crazy stuff. Yeah. So crazy stuff in my past that has made me into who I am today. And obviously fast forward to now I like to say we're young men. I don't know. We're probably not young. We're probably not old. Mid-30s.
You're a little younger than I am now, though.
Yeah, so you're late 30s.
Has he talked about the car wreck on the podcast before?
I don't think I have.
I don't think so.
I mean, not the wreck, but the running over. Good grief.
Yeah,
No, I don't think so.
No, I haven't. So you're trying to get me to talk about it?
Yes.
All right.
You can't just casually mention that and say, oh, yeah.
Well, so a lot of our church knows it and they listen, but I know there's a lot more people that listen. So I was 5 years old. I was around the corner playing at my friend's house. My dad came to get me because we had to go pick up. You probably know my aunt and uncle Ken and Kay Burgess, missionaries to Spain.
Oh, yeah.
With Tanya and Nathan Herod and all those guys. So at this point, Ken and Kay, I think they were in the States and they had just adopted their son Cameron, or they were in Argentina flying back to the States to get Cameron. Well, anyway, regardless, Ken and Kay were flying into Houston. And so we were late to pick them up from the airport. So Dad came to where I was at to get me. So I jumped on the bike. I run home. Around the corner, there's a 16-year-old kid driving. He's speeding. I didn't stop at the stop sign. We're both at fault. And he was going too fast, and I was in the middle of the road. And so it was just a collision. He hit me at 45 miles an hour, sent me straight up in the air, came down on my head. So, there was no blood. I had a scratch where the handlebars of my bike hit me. But shortly after that, I started having seizures. Still to this day, sometimes I stutter. sometimes I get hung up on words and they'll kind of draw out a couple of seconds. That's because of that. But God did heal me from the seizures, and I thank God for that. And I think that there's sometimes even today that just the whole human nature, the pride sets in, especially like I talk for a living. Like I'm a communicator, I'm a preacher, and then I'll stutter sometimes and get hung up on my words. But I just have to go back to the fact that I do that because that's God's reminder. That's my reminder of God's faithfulness in my life, of what could have happened. And so I think there's traumatic instances in your life that you can look back to and say, that's the faithfulness of God in my life. And so now fast forward, Calah and I, 3 kids, we're pastoring. You and Sherry, 3 kids, pastoring. And we're pastoring established churches that we don't deserve.
Oh my goodness.
And people, the trust of you like to cry, and I like to cry. So
this is going to get pathetic really quickly.
Turn it off, people. But we hold the trust of men and women that we don't deserve. Mm-hmm. You know, people, highly successful people, careers, just business owners. You know, this is the people that attend our churches, and it's the faithfulness of God. But you've also had some encounters where you and Sherry had to grow together and learn to trust God with your kids. Yeah. And there's been a lot of stuff there. So I think maybe the theme of this podcast is we can encourage people that what they're going through, God can use it. And it might not end like you want, and it might not end like you pray for it to end, or maybe it does. But regardless, you know, the Bible says we're overcome by the blood of the Lamb and the word of our testimony. And sometimes our testimonies aren't very pretty, but we're overcome by them. So maybe let's use the word testimony. There you go. So of kind of the things that you guys have been through with the kids.
Yeah, and that's the scripture I quote whenever I talk about this. Mostly, sometimes it's just to tell myself that, because I don't like to share personal stuff that publicly by nature.
And here we are telling it.
Welcome to the podcast. And just go ahead.
Hope it's so, folks.
But what I found is that the reason I went through those in the first place was just so that the testimony meant something to somebody.
That's right.
Because otherwise, I mean, like talking about the depression thing, the reason that anybody buys into it is because I went through it and have been through it and still, honestly, still deal with it and know how to deal with it now. But they don't listen if you've never experienced it. And it's hard to tell people with the stuff with our kids. What's happened with us over the years has opened up so many doors. My wife has been talking to perfect strangers that just notice the autism pin or the socks or whatever, and they stop her and ask her, who do you know? Because as soon as somebody is touched by that, like it's not like a special club, but it's like, oh my goodness, I can talk to somebody that gets it. And she's cried with so many random strangers. One time we were in the park, she's just talking to some random mommy on a bench, and I look over there and they're both wiping away tears. I'm like, oh, I get it. I know what's happening right now. But I guess I kind of I skipped to the middle of the story, but I'm going to give you the most condensed version that's possible, because otherwise you're going to be like, oh my goodness. Now I'm depressed. Our kids have dealt with sickness from the time that they were born. Our first son spent the first 2 years of his life, 18 months of those, he had MRSA staph infection, so he was in constant pain. We lost track of the ear infections by about 32 of them, so that was just constant with both of them. My oldest son noticed pretty early in life that he wasn't meeting certain milestones at the same time as other kids. I noticed that his thumbs were not quite as, he wasn't quite as dexterous with his thumbs as the other kids were. Little stuff like that, some eye contact stuff and all that. And we're dealing with that. He's not talking. The other kids are starting to talk. And I remember there was a friend I was talking to, and we were just having a conversation. He brought it up the other day. It's Paul Price in Arkansas.
He'll actually be here next week.
Oh my God, dude, Paul. There's not anybody else on the planet like Paul Price.
He's a great guy.
And he's talking to me on the phone. He said, yeah. And I heard his daughter say, I love you, Daddy. And I asked him, I said, Paul, when did they start saying that to you? And he's like, why? I was like, because Raylan's still not saying it, man. Like, we say it to him every night. My wife will always, it was our routine. Like, I would take him upstairs to put him to sleep. And we had a little routine we went through. My wife, she had a routine. She would say, I love you, baby, and kiss him. Well, he would say this little phrase, and we don't know what the word was supposed to be. And he said, Tama. And when he said Tama, that meant, like, leave me alone. Yeah. I don't know why, but that was his word. And so she would say, I love you, baby, Tama. And then we go upstairs. And I started getting worried. And so I take his hand every night, and I put it on my chest, and I say, Daddy. And then I put his hand on his chest and I say, Raylan. And I'm trying to teach him his name too, because that's not registering. And we start noticing different stuff. He's still not saying I love you, but I'm driving down the road one day and I'm like trying to teach him shapes. And like, look, buddy, it's a yield sign. So I'm like, look, red. And he goes, equilateral triangle. I'm like, thank you for that. But would you please say I love you to your mother and your father? Because that would mean a lot more. It's impressive, but it would mean a lot more to us. And he learned it off YouTube.
Geometry, and let's talk about our emotions.
Yeah. Thanks for your undying love and support. But how about that dodecahedron that I asked you to draw? And
That's great.
yeah, so every night we're doing the same thing. We have our second child. 3 months into it, we just get a diagnosis from it was actually a children's school in Plano, Texas. Oh. And a cool story there with my grandmother actually was airlifted to a hospital a mile away from there while we were there, and I was able to be with my grandmother the last night that she was alive, simply because we were in there to be tested. That's a different story. But while we're there, they do all this testing, and they bring us to the room, and they say, hey, okay, listen, these are the results. Spatially and sequentially, he's on the far end of like the outer limits of genius. Verbally, socially, he's now over here on the other side. So he has some incredible gifts, but we cannot promise you that you're ever going to have a conversation with your son. We can't promise you that he's ever going to be able to do certain things like just recognize you're even speaking to him. We can't tell you how it's going to turn out for you. But here's some things you can do. We recommend ABA therapy. They ask us all sorts of questions, and I see my wife. My wife's just crying, and I'm grateful to have an answer because now we know what we should try to do. But my wife is just devastated. And at first, not knowing how this is going to turn out, my wife is saying stuff like, I found her crying on the floor one day. I come home from work, and he's crying in another room. He was actually banging on a toy piano and crying. And my wife is crying on the floor, and she's like, I just watched this video. And I'm like, what did you watch? And she said, just watch it. And I'm watching this mom talk about her kid who was on the spectrum, and she said, I had to mourn my child. Not the child that I have, but the child that I thought that I was going to have. Because Sherry's like, my son, who I love with everything, is not going to be able to communicate with me possibly. And so this is where we are. And we're dealing with that. And then his brother's born, River. And so River, 3 months into it, gets RSV. It develops into double pneumonia. It develops so rapidly that he winds up in the hospital. We're trying to deal with this. And the doctor comes into the room and he says, I'm going to be honest. We got about a 50-50 shot here. And we looked at each other like, what do you mean 50-50? 50-50 what? And he said,
kind of general,
vague. And he said, survivability. And we didn't know that was in the cards, that was even a debate. And he said, no. He said, it's progressed so quickly to this point, I cannot promise you anything. We're looking at about 50-50. Here's the breathing treatments. Sherry's gone. She's like in a different dimension. My mother-in-law's with us. My mom gets up there to help. And I have to take Raylan home. And so I don't know how to process this. But I'm like, I'm still going to try to do what we know to do. So I take Raylan up the stairs. We go through our little routine. There's no mommy to say I love you tonight. But I'm laying down there on the bed with him, and I take his hand and I put it on my chest. Daddy, Raylan, Daddy. And he looks at me. He goes, Tama. And I'm praying, and I'm like, God, I know you're real. I preach about you to young people, and I tell them that you're a healer, and you can do this, you can do that. But right now, I don't feel like you hear us. And we were saying this together in private. I don't know if he's hearing us right now. Why is he not hearing us? And I'm praying, and Raylan puts his hand up on my mouth. And I'm like, God, you got to just give me those 3 words. Just let me know that my son does love me, for one thing. And he puts his hand up on my mouth, and I'm like, oh, here it goes, Lord, I receive it. It's like whenever a preacher comes to pray for you, and you're like, I receive it. And they're like totally off, And I'm like, what's going to happen? He puts his hand up there, and he says, in Jesus' name.
Oh, my goodness.
And instantly I was like, whoa. And I tried to tell Sherry about it the next day, but she's like, that's nice. Our son's almost dead, so she's not getting it.
Naturally so.
Oh, my goodness. And I'm trying, man, I'm sorry, I'm rambling.
No, this is great, man.
So River recovers, thank God. He comes home, but she still can't leave the house yet. And I take Raylan to church. And at the end of service, I preach. My dad has Raylan on the little subwoofer on the platform, and he's in my dad's lap. And he's just sitting there doing his own thing in his own world. And I'm praying over my son again. And I go over there and I grab Raylan's head, and I'm praying for him. And I'm crying. It's like desperation.
Yeah.
And later, two different people from two different sides of the auditorium that were not connected to one another, don't even know each other, said this, told us later, they said, when y'all were praying for Raylan, it was like this white cloud, but like almost like a bubble surrounded y'all three. And the whole time you were praying, I saw it. And all I can think of now, this is angels covering us.
Yeah.
And I take him home, and I'm all excited. I'm like, oh, we had a great service. And my wife's like, that's fine. Our son almost dead. My other son almost, but maybe he's never going to talk to you. And at that point, I'm like, well, you don't know what God's going to do. And barely believing it myself. And she says, Raylan, I love you, baby. And he turned around and he said, I love you, mommy.
Goodness.
And then she went, wow. I started going crazy. I mean, you've seen her, so they're a little demonstrative, the Brandon family. And so she's going crazy. And from that day forward, we give a lot of credit to ABA therapy. Yeah. We also see what God did in him rapidly. And over the next few years, he starts talking. Things didn't get easy. Like, there's challenges today. He's 10 years old now. Yeah. And our son River, 3 years old, his appendix ruptures. The doctors don't believe us. We say it's appendicitis. He's like, it's not appendicitis. His appendix ruptures because they delay. They have to go into emergency surgery. He spends another 7 days in the hospital. 6 years old, during the very beginning of COVID. Or would it be 5? I can't remember. Whatever it is. So very beginning of COVID, my wife has our daughter, Georgia. My wife almost codes every single time she has a baby. She nearly dies every single time she has a kid. And the doctors still don't know why. They can't explain it. And so that's all happening. There's still sicknesses. There's still all this stuff going on. River gets something called rhabdomyolysis, which his legs stop working. And she's in the hospital because she almost dies again. The baby's at home with my mother-in-law. River gets rhabdomyolysis. His kidneys start shutting down. We're like, what's going to happen? But at this point, something happened during the whole process. And so many milestones were hit. And then the doctor tells my wife, I'm sorry, but you have lupus.
Oh, my God. I didn't know that. Wow.
Yeah, so it's like boom, boom, boom. If you're listening and you weren't depressed, you're depressed now. My wife, he tells her, you have lupus. And you got to remember, we were saying at this time, I don't know if God even hears us. Yeah. Why is this happening? And some breaking point took place. She says, okay, gets off the phone. And she said, he tells me that I've got lupus. And I'm like, baby. And I tried to hug her, and she said, no, let's pray first. And we got on either side of Raylan's bed. It's a little tiny bed. Yeah. And she starts praying. We pray together. We have this awesome little prayer meeting. It doesn't last long. We get up. She said, it's fine. Turns out it was some other allergy. The doctor was totally wrong. Even through the testing was wrong. Something happened. Overnight, everything changes. And one piece after another falls into place. And for the first time in our lives, we've been in pastors' homes, both of us, our entire lives. We've been through so much individually before we met each other. And then all of a sudden, our lives come together and chaos ensues. But only at the end of that have we finally been able to say that genuinely we now know we trust God. Yeah. Because we didn't. And we said that we did, and we didn't. And then he showed up, and now I don't have any other choice. And
you've got an experience, but more than an experience, you have an encounter.
Yeah.
And I think that as multi-generational minister families, I think that maybe we can pull the veil back a little bit. And you and I are privileged to lead, like we've already said, churches that we don't deserve, people's trust and influence over people's lives that we don't deserve to have. But that only comes at a cost. And the reality is while we don't deserve it, we did pay the price and sacrifice, and that's validated by us being here. And that's something that we're grateful for. But it doesn't matter. Scripture said, unless a seed falls on the ground and dies, it abides alone. And every minister, every business owner, every woman and man of God, no matter what your vocation is, they're going to have to be put in the ground and die. And then we bear fruit. And so
praise break.
It's crazy, man. So here's something cool.
Can I interject right here?
Yes.
Go ahead, babe.
Okay, I'm going to interject. So when is Raylan's birthday?
He was an hour and a half away from being born on 11/1/11. Instead of that, he was born on Halloween.
Awesome. So he'll be 11, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So y'all's story helped us tremendously, and y'all don't even know this. So Presley is a year younger than Raylan, and before Presley was born, Trent's sister, her first baby, passed away. She was in a drowning accident, and that was April of 2012, and we're sitting in a hospital room, and the doctor comes and tells Redona and Hector that, she's not going to make it. And, just the horrible news that, no parent wants to hear. And I'm sitting there, and no one knows this. Trent don't even know this. But all of a sudden, I really believe for the first time, I dealt with fear in a second. And I'm pregnant with Presley. And it's like, okay, there's going to be something wrong with my child. Something's going to happen to my child. And no one knows this. And the moment that I think this, Brother Wayne McLean, he's sitting right
pastor. He was with us.
He was sitting right beside me. And it may have been 2 seconds after that thought entered my mind. He turns to me and he puts his hand on my belly and he says, nothing's wrong with him. In Jesus' name. And he prays a little prayer and he says, nothing is wrong with him. And I thought, oh my gosh. Obviously he knew, he knew, but I had not even expressed to Trent that fear that suddenly came over me. Fast forward.
He said nothing's wrong with him. Don't worry. God's going to use his voice.
Yes.
Now fast forward.
His voice. God's going to use his voice. Fast forward. Presley is a year old and he's making noises like, a 1-year-old should. Fast forward 15 months old. And I'm like, I feel like he should be saying, mama or dada or, no words. It's just noises. Fast forward 2 years old, still nothing. And so I voice, 2-year checkup, I voice my concerns to our pediatrician. He's like, no, I really don't expect to start to understand them till they're 3 years old. And so I took his word for it, but still something inside of me, I was like, there's something wrong. 3-year checkup, I'm like, okay, something is wrong. My child is still not talking. And so they did all the tests. I mean, every test you can imagine. And did the autism test,
Hearing, everything.
Everything. Nothing's wrong. We can't find anything. And I'm like, my child cannot say mom, cannot say dad. He's just making noises. Presley had noises like Raylan did. And that, we still think of them, these noises he had. 4 years old, still nothing. And so we're like at our wits' end, what do we do? So we enrolled him in preschool thinking, okay, maybe he'll be around other children. What I did was wrong is I compared him to other children. I'm like, these kids are running circles around him in their speech and all these things. And here Presley I think he would say no and bye by the time he was 4. And y'all's story uplifted me so much. Y'all don't even know this. But so he goes to preschool, and by the end of pre-K, he can say 20, 30-ish words.
It was very low.
And so we put him in speech therapy. And he was in speech therapy 4 years.
3 times a week, 4 years.
Yeah, 4 years. And then he graduated his outsourced therapy. He graduated 2 years ago. And if you notice talking to him, he still has trouble with like his R's. But he is no longer needed for the outsourced therapy. He still takes it in school, but they couldn't ever find anything. Nothing was wrong with his hearing, nothing, but he was just a slow talker. And no reason why, but so many times we went back to what we were promised. God's going to use him, and he's going to use him through his speech. We may not know yet, but y'all's story was so uplifting, and especially when y'all found answers, and it uplifted us.
Y'all were finding answers and we didn't. You're crying. Stop.
We-
Y'all were finding answers and we weren't, but we took hope in the fact that you had answers, and that meant we would have answers one day.
Yes.
And now we do have answers, and it's it's awesome. But I think God, I don't know why he uses situations like this and why he allows things like this to happen. But this goes back to something you said at the very beginning. And I talked about this a little bit on Father's Day in my sermon, is Dad always taught me that you can trust God. And you don't know how to trust God until he puts you in a trial.
Yeah.
And I think today I'm grateful for trials, and I'm grateful for friends that we can sit down and talk with, and iron sharpens iron, and we can grow from. And we're crying right now. But we like to laugh too, man. Like I think that's a part of your testimony is you come from such, you probably always like to laugh to a certain extent, but
A little too loudly.
yes. But like today we were cracking up laughing. You said, "Oh God, I just messed up my throat because I was laughing so hard." But I think that's a part of the miracle of how God turns our mourning into dancing, our sorrow into joy. And Ryan, I'm grateful for your friendship, man.
Me too, man.
And thank you for sitting down. And if you're listening today, I know it was maybe a little different tone than our podcast normally have.
Sorry.
Sorry,
No.
but I'm not sorry.
Yeah.
Because your kids might be fine and your emotional health might be okay, but maybe your marriage isn't. And maybe you cry yourself to sleep at night, or you bang your head against the wall, or however you cope with your trial, whatever your trial is. But know that God sees you and he'll never forget you. And you can trust him. And Ryan, I love you, buddy. And I'm glad
Pray for you often.
Dude, I know. I text you a lot Sundays, or when I'm sermon prepping, I'm like, Ryan's probably doing the same thing right now, so let's text him. So I love you, man. Thanks you for coming on, and we'll have to do it again sometime, and we'll laugh next time instead of cry. Thanks, everybody, for listening or watching, and we hope you tune back in next week.